Hey everyone. Thanks for clicking. My name is Andrew. I'm 32 years old, and my family discovered I was a billionaire by watching the evening news while they were making fun of me at the dinner table. Before I tell you about the silence in that room, a silence so loud it could break glass, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's always amazing to see how far these stories can travel. It was a Sunday, one of those perfect, crisp autumn Sundays in Bellevue, Washington, where the leaves are gold and the air smells like rain. My mom, Eleanor, always insisted on these family dinners. She called them a sacred tradition, but for me, they had become a monthly ritual of quiet endurance. I parked my 6-year-old Subaru behind my brother Ethan's gleaming new BMW and my sister Chloe's immaculate Audi. The car felt like me, reliable, unassuming, and completely out of place in this driveway. I took a deep breath before walking up to the door. I could already hear their laughter through the thick oak. It was the easy, confident sound of people who had never known what it felt like to be on the outside looking in, even in their own home. Inside, the scene was exactly as I'd pictured. My father, Richard, was holding a glass of scotch, listening intently as Ethan, my older brother, recounted some triumphant deal at Goldman Sachs. Chloe, a high-powered corporate lawyer, was nodding along, adding her own stories of courtroom victories. They were the Morrisons everyone saw, the successful banker, the sharp lawyer, the proud parents. And then there was me, the glitch in the family portrait. Look who it is. The startup founder has graced us with his presence, Ethan said, his voice dripping with the kind of cheerful condescension he'd perfected over the years. Andrew, we were just talking about your little tech project, my sister Chloe added, a smile on her face that didn't quite reach her eyes. I think it's wonderful you have a hobby, Ethan continued, clapping me on the shoulder a little too hard. Keeps you busy. I just smiled. A small, tight smile I had mastered. It was my armor. I murmured a hello and went to help my mom in the kitchen. She gave me a hug, but her eyes were worried. It was the same look she always gave me, a mixture of love and deep, profound confusion, as if she couldn't figure out where she'd gone wrong with her youngest son. The air was thick with unspoken disappointment. They didn't know that miles away, in a sleek high-rise in Seattle, my hobby was about to send a shockwave through the financial world. They didn't know that a journalist from Bloomberg had spent the last month verifying every detail of my life. And I didn't know that she had decided to break the story 12 hours early. We all sat down at the dinner table. The stage was set. The players were in their positions. And the curtain was about to rise on the most uncomfortable and ultimately liberating night of my life. To understand the silence that was coming, the silence that changed everything, you have to understand the noise that came before it. Years and years of it. The noise started early. It was the constant, deafening sound of my brother Ethan's success. He was 2 years older, and from the moment he could walk, he was destined for greatness in my parents' eyes. He was the star quarterback, the student body president, the kid who got a full-ride scholarship to USC and then an MBA from Wharton. He was the golden child, and his glow cast a very long shadow. I was different. While Ethan was at football practice, I was in my bedroom with a second-hand computer my dad had brought home from his office. I wasn't interested in throwing a ball. I was interested in learning Python. I was fascinated by how a few lines of code could create a world, solve a problem, build something from absolutely nothing. To me, it was magic. To my family, it was a weird obsession. I remember one afternoon in high school, it must have been around Thanksgiving. Ethan came home holding a massive, gleaming trophy for winning the state championship. My parents were ecstatic. The trophy was placed on the mantle, front and center. My dad, Richard, had tears in his eyes. "That's my boy," he'd said, his voice thick with pride. "A true leader." Later that evening, I quietly showed them a small plaque I had won at a statewide programming competition. It wasn't shiny. It was just a piece of laminated wood with some text on it. My dad picked it up, squinted at it and said, "What's this thing?" "Some computer club award. It's for a program I wrote," I tried to explain. "It organizes data sets." "That's nice, son," he said, patting my shoulder before turning his attention back to Ethan's trophy. Just make sure you're keeping up with your real subjects. My mom was gentler, but just as confused. Andrew, honey, she'd say, you need to develop your social skills. You can't spend your whole life staring at a screen. Computers are just a hobby. It was the family mantra. It's just a hobby. A phase I would hopefully outgrow, like playing with Legos. They loved me, I know they did. But they didn't understand me. Not even a little. They saw the world through a very specific lens. A good college, a stable corporate job with a high salary, a clear path to a corner office. My path was a tangled mess of wires and code they couldn't comprehend. The only person who seemed to get it was my computer science professor in community college, Evelyn Reed. She was a brilliant, sharp woman who saw the spark in my eyes. After I aced her advanced algorithms class, she called me into her office. Andrew, she said, leaning forward, you have a gift. What you're doing isn't just schoolwork. You have a vision for how technology can work. Don't ever let anyone tell you that's not a real career. I felt a surge of hope. I convinced her to come to a parent-teacher meeting, thinking that maybe, if they heard it from an expert, they would finally understand. Professor Reed spoke passionately about my potential, about the future of artificial intelligence. My parents listened politely. They smiled and nodded. As we were walking to the car, my dad put his arm around me. She seems like a nice lady, he said. But let's be realistic. We have that whole college fund set aside for you. Let's not get distracted by these niche interests. You need a degree that leads to a real promotion, a real career. That was the moment I realized I was completely on my own. They weren't just uncomprehending. They were actively discouraging me. They believed they were protecting me from failure, but what they were really doing was building the walls of my cage. That night, I sat in my room, the sound of my family laughing downstairs feeling like it was coming from another planet. And I made a decision. If they weren't going to believe in my world, I would have to build it myself, brick by digital brick. They thought it was a phase, a weird hobby. They had no idea I was building my escape. At 19, I took the first real leap. I dropped out of community college. To my family, this was not a brave step towards a dream. It was a catastrophic failure. It was the ultimate confirmation of all their fears. You're throwing your life away, my father yelled, his face red. We had a college fund for you, a future. For this? For some pipe dream you cooked up in your bedroom. It's not a pipe dream, Dad. It's a company, I said, my voice barely a whisper. My first startup was a disaster. It was a social media analytics tool that was, frankly, ahead of its time. I poured my meager savings into it, worked 18-hour days from a tiny, windowless office, and after a year it imploded. I was broke and utterly humiliated. The phone call from Ethan was worse than going bankrupt. Heard about your little venture, he said, no sympathy in his voice. Look, Andy, I get it. You wanted to try something. But maybe it's time to accept that this startup thing isn't for everyone. I can make some calls, maybe get you an entry-level IT job at the bank. It's a real job, with a real salary. Every word was a perfectly aimed dart. The implication was clear. You failed. Now come back to the real world, and let the adults handle things. I'm not everyone, Ethan, I said, my jaw tight. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking. The "I told you so" from my family wasn't spoken, but it was in every look, every concerned sigh, every suggestion that I should get my life back on track. My second startup lasted 18 months before it ran out of cash. This time, I didn't even tell them the details. I just let them assume I was still tinkering with computers. The shame was a physical weight. I was living on ramen and fumes, and the dream felt further away than ever. It was during this time, at my absolute lowest, that I met Liam Chin. I was hunched over a laptop in a cheap 24-hour coffee shop, trying to salvage a piece of code from my failed company, when he sat down across from me. That's an elegant recursive function, he said, pointing at my screen. I looked up, startled. He was another programmer, I could tell by the laptop covered in coding stickers. We started talking. I told him about my failures, about my ideas for a new kind of AI that could predict consumer behavior with terrifying accuracy. I expected him to laugh or to offer condolences. Instead, he listened. He listened with an intensity no one, not even Professor Reed, ever had. His eyes lit up. He didn't see a failure. He saw the potential. "You're not wrong about the idea," he said after I finished. "You're just early, and you've been trying to do it alone." That afternoon, in that dingy coffee shop, we sketched out the first framework for what would become Nexus AI on the back of a napkin. For the first time, I wasn't just Andrew, the family disappointment. I was a co-founder. I had a partner. Liam's belief in me was a lifeline. He was the first person in my world who didn't look at my dreams and see a hobby. He saw a blueprint. The family still saw a mess. At Christmas that year, Ethan announced his latest promotion. Chloe announced she'd made partner at her law firm. They asked me what I was up to. "I'm working on a new project," I said vaguely. "With a partner." "Oh, that's nice," my mom said, forcing a smile. "Is it paying?" I shook my head. The silence that followed was heavy with pity. I knew what they were thinking. Poor Andrew, still playing his little games. They had no idea that the game was about to get very, very real. Starting Nexus AI with Liam was like breathing air for the first time after nearly drowning. We had a vision, we had the skills, but we had no money. We spent months working out of Liam's garage, living off credit cards and the kind of blind faith that looks like insanity to everyone else. We knew we needed seed funding. That meant creating a pitch deck and facing the brutal world of venture capitalists. We were two young guys with a powerful idea but no track record. We got 100 no's. They came in all forms. Polite emails, harsh critiques, and even outright laughter in one memorable meeting. "Your valuation is absurd," one VC told us, leaning back in his leather chair. "Come back when you have a product and actual users." The constant rejection was draining, but every no just made us work harder. Finally, we got a meeting with a group of angel investors. Among them was a man named Mark Jensen. He was older, charismatic, and seemed genuinely impressed by our demo. He saw the potential. "Boys, I think you're onto something big," he said, his eyes gleaming. He agreed to lead our first round of funding. It wasn't much, just enough to get us out of the garage and into a small, shared office space, but it felt like we'd won the lottery. I remember calling my mom to share the news. "Mom, we got funding. An investor gave us money to build the company." There was a pause on the other end. "Oh, honey, that's nice. But is it a loan? You have to be careful with debt." "No, Mom, he invested. He bought a piece of the company. He believes in us." "Well, just be careful," she said, her voice laced with anxiety. "These things can be tricky. Your father and I just worry." I hung up, the excitement draining out of me. They didn't hear we got funded. They heard, "My son is getting into complicated financial trouble." The family gatherings during this period were particularly tough. My Aunt Carol, my dad's sister, was always there, stirring the pot with a sweet smile. She'd look at me with such pity. "Oh, Andrew, you're working so hard on that computer thing," she'd say, loud enough for my parents to hear. "I just hope you have a backup plan. The real world is so unforgiving." Then she'd turn to my mom. "Eleanor, I just worry about the boy. Richard put so much aside for his college fund. It's a shame to see him chasing these fantasies instead of getting a stable career. What if he needs that money for a real emergency someday?" She was a master of passive aggression, planting seeds of doubt that she knew would flourish in the fertile ground of my parents' anxiety. Every word she spoke reinforced their narrative, that I was reckless, irresponsible, and destined for failure. I could see it in their eyes. They were already preparing for the day I'd come home, broke and defeated, to finally take that entry-level IT job Ethan was holding out for me like a sad consolation prize. They were waiting for me to give up. And that was the one thing I was determined never to do. With Mark Jensen's seed money, Nexus AI started to crawl out of the primordial ooze. We hired our first 2 employees, Maria and Ben, and finally had a working prototype. We landed a few small clients, then a few mid-sized ones. For the first time, we had revenue. It wasn't much, but it was proof. It was real. This small success, however, put us on the radar. In the tech world, That's both a blessing and a curse. It meant we attracted not just clients, but also predators. The biggest one was David Chun, the CEO of a rival AI company called Innovate Dynamics. They were bigger, better funded, and notoriously aggressive. I knew we were in trouble when I heard David Chun had reached out to Liam directly. Liam told me about it immediately. "He wants to have lunch," Liam said, looking uneasy. "Just a friendly chat between two top engineers in the field." "There's nothing friendly about David Chun," I warned him. "He's a shark. He'll smell blood in the water." Liam went to the lunch. I trusted him, but I couldn't help the knot of anxiety twisting in my stomach. Our company was still fragile. Liam wasn't just my co-founder. He was the lead architect of our entire system. Losing him wouldn't be a setback. It would be a death blow. 2 hours later, Liam walked back into our tiny office. He looked pale. He sat down and was silent for a full minute. My heart was pounding. "He offered me a job," Liam said finally. "I figured," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "No, you don't understand," Liam said, looking me straight in the eye. "He offered me a package that is life-changing. A 7-figure salary, a huge signing bonus, a vice president title. He said Nexus AI is a sinking ship and I should get on a lifeboat before it's too late." I felt the blood drain from my face. That was an offer I couldn't even dream of matching. We were barely paying ourselves enough to cover rent. For a moment, I saw it all fall apart. The long nights, the sacrifices, the ramen noodles, all for nothing. "He wants me to bring our core algorithm with me," Liam continued quietly. "He said he'd double the signing bonus if I did. So that was the play. Not just to hire my best engineer, but to steal the very soul of our company." It was a kill shot. I looked at Liam, my friend, my partner. Couldn't be angry. I could only be honest. "Liam, I can't compete with that offer. You know our financials. We're running on fumes. If you want to take it, I'll understand. You have a family to think about." Liam stared at me, and then he did something I didn't expect. He laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was a short, sharp, incredulous bark. "Take it?" he said, shaking his head. "Andrew, did you really think I would?" I told him to take his 7-figure salary and his lifeboat and shove it. I told him we're not building a lifeboat. We're building a battleship. The relief that washed over me was so intense I felt dizzy. "Why?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "He was offering you everything." "He was offering me a job," Liam corrected me. "You and I? We're on a mission. I didn't get into this to be a wealthy vice president at someone else's company. I got into this to build Nexus AI with you." That was the moment I knew we were going to make it. David Chun had tried to break us, but he had only made us stronger. He had tested the foundation of our company, and it had held firm. The loyalty Liam showed me that day was worth more than any venture capital. It was the rock on which we would build everything that came next. Just when we thought we had weathered the worst of the storm, a new threat emerged, this time from within. Our angel investor, Mark Jensen, the man who had supposedly believed in us from the start, started acting strangely. He called for more meetings, demanded more frequent and detailed reports, and his friendly demeanor was replaced with a sharp, critical edge. "The burn rate is too high, Andrew," he'd say during our weekly calls. "The client acquisition cost is not sustainable." At first, I thought it was just the normal pressure from an investor. But then the comments became more personal. "Are you sure you have the experience to lead this company through its next phase?" he asked one day. "Maybe you need a more seasoned CEO, someone with a stronger business background." Liam and I were getting nervous. We were approaching the end of our seed funding. We were in that terrifying period that startups call the Valley of Death, where you have a product but not enough revenue to be self-sustaining, and you desperately need your next round of funding to survive. Mark knew this, and he decided to use it to his advantage. He called an emergency board meeting. There were only 5 of us on the board, me, Liam, Mark, and 2 other small investors he had brought in. The agenda he sent out was vague. Discussion of company leadership and strategic direction. My stomach sank. I knew exactly what was coming. The meeting was in a sterile, rented conference room. Mark didn't waste any time. "Gentlemen," he began, "I'm concerned. I believe in Nexus AI's technology, but I've lost faith in its current leadership. Andrew is a brilliant programmer, but he is not a CEO. We are burning through cash, and we need a firm hand to guide us to profitability. Therefore, I am proposing a motion to remove Andrew Miller as CEO and begin a search for an experienced replacement." It was a corporate assassination attempt. I was stunned. The man who had smiled and shaken my hand in our first meeting was now trying to steal the company I had bled for. I looked at the two other investors. They wouldn't meet my eyes. Mark had clearly gotten to them beforehand. "This is insane." Liam cut in, his voice shaking with anger. "Andrew is this company. His vision is the only reason any of us are in this room." "Vision doesn't pay the bills," Mark said coolly. "It's a simple vote. All in favor of the motion." Mark raised his hand. His two allies followed suit. It was 3-2. I was out. Just like that. My throat closed up. I felt a cold, hollow dread spread through my chest. This was it. After everything, I was going to be kicked out of my own company. But then, something happened. As Mark was about to declare the motion passed, I found my voice. "This vote isn't valid," I said, my voice quiet but clear. Mark scoffed. "What are you talking about? It's a simple majority." "You're forgetting something," I said, pushing a document across the table. It was our original shareholder agreement. "You're forgetting Article 4, Section B, the clause on founder control. It states that any vote regarding the removal of a founding member requires a supermajority of 75%. Your 3 votes only constitute 60% of the board." I had insisted on that clause during our initial negotiations. My lawyer at the time, a guy fresh out of law school who gave me a discount, said it was a long shot but we should try. I had almost forgotten about it. But I'd spent so many nights reading and rereading those documents, trying to understand the world of business, that the clause was burned into my memory. The room went silent. Mark snatched the paper and his face went from smug to purple with rage. He had underestimated me. He saw me as a naive kid, a coder who didn't understand business. He never imagined I would have protected myself. The motion failed. The coup was over. Mark and his allies stormed out of the room. We had won, but barely. That day, I learned a brutal lesson. The sharks don't always circle from the outside. Sometimes they're the ones you let into the boat. Surviving Mark Jensen's attempted coup was a wake-up call. We were alive, but we were still bleeding money. We bought out Mark's shares at a valuation that nearly crippled us. A move fueled by equal parts desperation and defiance. We were free of him, but we were more desperate for funding than ever. We had maybe 3 months of runway left before we'd have to shut everything down for good. Our only hope was to land a whale, a client so large, so prestigious, that their business alone would make us profitable and attract new investors. Our number 1 target was a multinational retail corporation called Viridian Dynamics, and its legendary CEO, Marcus Vance. Getting a meeting with Marcus Vance was considered impossible. He was a titan of industry, a man who didn't take meetings with tiny, unproven startups. But we had an edge. Through one of our smaller clients, we heard that Viridian was struggling to understand the shifting behavior of their online customers. It was the exact problem Nexus AI was built to solve. We spent 2 weeks doing nothing but preparing. We pulled every all-nighter, ran every possible data model, and built a custom presentation that showed exactly how our AI could predict Viridian's customer trends and increase their sales by an estimated 15%. We sent the proposal through every channel we could find. We expected nothing. Then, one Tuesday morning, an email landed in my inbox. The subject line was simple: "From the office of Marcus Vance." My heart stopped. It was a summons. He would give us 30 minutes of his time. 30 minutes to save our company. The Viridian headquarters was an intimidating glass tower that seemed to touch the clouds. We were escorted to the top floor, to a boardroom with a view that stretched all the way to the Olympic Mountains. Marcus Vance was older than I expected, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through you. He didn't smile. "You have 30 minutes," he said, his voice a low rumble. Don't waste my time. I took a deep breath and began. I didn't give a canned sales pitch. I told him our story. I showed him the data. I spoke with a passion born from years of being told my ideas were worthless. I explained how our AI wasn't just code. It was a new way of understanding human connection in a digital world. Liam ran the live demo, and for once, there were no glitches. It worked perfectly. When I finished, the room was silent. Marcus Vance just stared at me, his expression unreadable. He hadn't asked a single question. Your prediction of a 15% sales increase, he said finally. You're confident in that number? No, sir, I said, my own boldness surprising me. I think it's a conservative estimate. He stared at me for another long 10 seconds. Felt like an eternity. Then, a slow smile spread across his face. He stood up and extended his hand. Kid, he said, his handshake firm. You've just changed the game. That handshake was the turning point. The contract with Viridian Dynamics wasn't just big. It was colossal. It saved our company overnight. But it did something more important. It gave us validation. The news of the deal rippled through the tech community. Suddenly, the VCs who had laughed us out of their offices were calling us. The game had changed, just like Marcus Vance said. We weren't just a struggling startup anymore. We were on our way. The Viridian Dynamics contract was like pouring gasoline on a fire. It gave us the credibility we needed to close our Series D funding round, and the terms were beyond our wildest dreams. The lead investor was one of Silicon Valley's most prestigious firms. They didn't just give us money. They gave us a valuation that made my head spin. Nexus AI, the company born on a coffee shop napkin and built in a garage, was now valued at $4.2 billion. The number felt fake. It was the kind of figure you read about in headlines, something that happened to other people. Liam and I sat in our new, much larger office, looking at the signed term sheet, and just laughed. It was the giddy, disbelieving laughter of two people who had stared into the abyss and somehow ended up on top of a mountain. Success on this scale doesn't stay quiet for long. A few weeks after the funding round closed, I got an email from a woman named Sarah Jenkins. The name in her signature made me do a double take. Senior technology reporter, Bloomberg. She wanted to do an exclusive feature story on Nexus AI. Not just a small piece, but a deep dive. The woman who made AI accessible, the proposed headline read. They hadn't realized from my name that I was a man. A common mistake. We corrected it to the founder who made AI accessible. She wanted to know everything. Our origin story, the technology, the struggle, and the sudden explosive valuation. I was hesitant. I was a private person. I was used to working in the background, letting the technology speak for itself. But my board and my new PR team insisted. This was a crucial moment. A feature in Bloomberg would cement our place in the industry. So I agreed. I spent hours on the phone with Sarah. She was brilliant, sharp, and incredibly thorough. She grilled me on every detail. She interviewed our clients, including Marcus Vance. She spoke to our early employees. She even talked to some of the VCs who had initially rejected us. She was piecing together the entire puzzle of our journey. Throughout the entire process, I didn't say a word to my family. What was I supposed to say? Hey Mom, Dad, you know that little hobby of mine? Well, Bloomberg is writing an article about how it's worth more than a small country's GDP. They would never believe me. It would just sound like another one of my fantasies. Their skepticism had become such a core part of our dynamic that I didn't know how to interact with them without it. Every time they asked what I was up to, I gave my standard vague answer. Oh, just busy with work. The day before the article was scheduled to go live, Sarah called me. Andrew, everything is fact-checked and ready. It's a great story. We're also running a short segment on the TV broadcast tomorrow evening to promote the article. Just giving you a heads up. A TV segment. I hadn't expected that. A flicker of unease went through me, but I pushed it aside. What were the chances my family would even see it? They usually watched the local news, not a business channel. It would be fine. I had managed to keep my two worlds, The world where I was a CEO and the world where I was a disappointment, completely separate for years. I saw no reason for that to change now. The text message arrived on a Thursday afternoon, right in the middle of a frantic pre-launch meeting for our new software update. It was from my mother. Family dinner Sunday at 6. Don't be late. Your father has news. My heart sank. A regular family dinner was bad enough. A family dinner where my father had news was a recipe for a truly miserable evening. It usually meant Ethan had gotten another promotion or a bigger bonus, and we would all be expected to spend 3 hours celebrating his endless list of achievements. I typed back a simple "okay, see you then." For the rest of the day, a sense of dread hung over me. As I drove home to my small, quiet apartment, I felt the familiar exhaustion wash over me. It was the deep, soul-crushing weariness of having to put on a mask. At Nexus AI, I was a leader. My team of over 400 employees looked to me for answers. Our investors trusted me with hundreds of millions of dollars. In that building, my voice mattered. But the moment I walked into my parents' house, I would shrink. I would become poor Andrew again, the lost son who played on his computer. I would have to listen to my father's passive-aggressive advice about getting a real career, endure Ethan's smug jokes, and see the pity in my mother's eyes. It was a role I had been forced to play for so long, it felt like a second skin. I thought about canceling. I could say I was sick, or that I had a work emergency. It would be so easy. But I knew it would just lead to a week of worried phone calls from my mom and another lecture from my dad about responsibility. It was easier to just go, endure it, and get it over with. That Sunday, as I got ready, I felt a strange sense of calm. The Bloomberg article was going live the next morning. The TV segment was scheduled to air sometime that evening. It felt like I was living in the final hours of a secret life. Tomorrow, the world would know the truth about Nexus AI. But tonight, for one last time, I would be Andrew Miller, the family failure. I stood in my office, which took up a corner of my living room, and looked at the whiteboard covered in complex algorithms. It was my real world, the world of logic, data, and creation. Then I looked at the clock. It was time to go to the world of judgment, of unspoken expectations and quiet disappointment. I put on my armor, that small, tight smile, and walked out the door, completely unaware that the two worlds I had fought so hard to keep separate were about to collide with the force of an atomic bomb, right in the middle of my mother's dining room. The dinner started just as I had predicted. My father's news was that Ethan's year-end bonus was even larger than expected, and he was using it to buy a vacation home in the San Juan Islands. A real investment in property, my dad said, beaming at Ethan, then giving me a pointed look. Solid. Tangible. Not like throwing money at... Well, I knew. I took a bite of my mom's pot roast and said nothing. "So, Andy," Ethan said, leaning forward with a smirk, "how's the internet business going? Still playing around in your digital sandbox?" Chloe, my sister, chimed in. "Be nice, Ethan. Andrew is very serious about his little project. He has a partner and everything now, right?" The word partner was delivered as if she were talking about a childhood imaginary friend. "It's going well, thanks," I said, keeping my voice even. "Is it profitable yet?" My father asked bluntly. It was his favorite question. "We're reinvesting all our revenue into growth," I replied, using the standard startup line. It was true, but I knew how it sounded to them. It sounded like an excuse. It sounded like, "No." Ethan laughed. "That's a classic. I hear that from guys whose companies are about to go under. It's the polite way of saying you're broke." "I'm not broke, Ethan." Okay, he said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "So you're paying yourself a decent salary then?" The word hung in the air. Salary. To them, it was the ultimate measure of worth. A steady paycheck from a reputable company. That was success. "It's not really about the salary right now," I started to explain. "It's about building asset value, about equity." My father cut me off. "Equity in what, Andrew? A website? You can't pay a mortgage with a website." He shook his head, a look of genuine frustration on his face. "I just don't get what you do all day. Your mother and I, we worry. You're 32 years old. It's time to grow up and get a real job. It's not too late. You could still have a decent career. Every word was a familiar sting. I had heard this speech 100 times. I usually just absorbed it, letting it wash over me. But tonight was different. Tonight, I knew something they didn't. It felt like watching a movie where I was the only one who knew the ending. I think it's amazing that he keeps at it, Chloe said, her voice full of the kind of condescending praise you'd give a child who made a messy drawing. It shows persistence. Ethan took a long sip of his expensive red wine. I guess, he said with a sigh, but there's a thin line between persistence and delusion. At some point, you have to look at the facts. My career trajectory is a straight line up. Chloe is a partner at one of the top law firms in the state. And you, Andy, you're stagnant. It's not a growth trajectory. It's a flat line. He leaned back, satisfied with his pronouncement. My father nodded in agreement. My mother looked down at her plate, her silence a form of assent. They had delivered their verdict. In the high court of the Miller family, I had been judged and found wanting. I was a failure, a flatline. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just picked up my fork and continued eating. There was nothing I could say that would change their minds. Words were useless now. Only a spectacle would do. And, as fate would have it, a spectacle was just moments away. As Ethan was launching into another story about a multi-million-dollar merger he was handling, my dad stood up and walked over to the television in the corner of the dining room. Damn thing's been acting up, he muttered, adjusting the antenna. He switched it on, keeping the volume low. The local news was ending. A commercial for a car dealership flickered across the screen. Then the intro for a national news program began. It was a major network, but the segment was from their financial news division, the one that partnered with Bloomberg. I just want to catch the market report, my dad said, sitting back down. The screen cut to a sharp, professional-looking anchorwoman in a bright blue dress. And in our top business story tonight, she said, her voice crisp and authoritative. A major shakeup in the world of artificial intelligence. I felt a cold jolt, a sudden surge of adrenaline. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. No, I thought. Can't be. Sarah said tomorrow. The tech world is buzzing about a company that has, until now, operated largely under the radar. The anchor continued. We're talking about Nexus AI, a Seattle-based startup that has just closed a monumental Series D funding round, rocketing its valuation to an astonishing $4.2 billion. The number just hung in the air. $4.2 billion, Ethan scoffed. $4 billion for some AI company nobody's ever heard of. This tech bubble is getting ridiculous. Hush, Ethan, I want to hear this, my dad said, leaning forward. And then it happened. The screen behind the anchorwoman changed. It was no longer the generic news logo. It was the sleek, minimalist logo of my company. My logo. Below it, in a professional headshot I had taken just 2 months ago, was my face. My name was printed in bold white letters at the bottom. Andrew Miller, founder and CEO. The room fell silent. Not quiet. Silent. It was a sudden, violent absence of sound. The clinking of silverware stopped. The conversation died. Breathing seemed to cease. It was the kind of silence that presses in on you, so heavy it feels like a physical force. My father stared at the screen, his mouth slightly agape. His glass of scotch was frozen in his hand. Ethan's smug expression had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed look of utter disbelief. That can't be you, he stammered, pointing a trembling finger at the TV. I met his gaze across the table and said nothing. The company's groundbreaking algorithm, the anchor was saying, her voice the only sound in the universe, is the brainchild of its founder, Andrew Miller, who started the company in a garage with just a few $1,000s of savings. My mother made a small, choked sound. She put her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with a confusion so profound it looked like pain. Chloe had already pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. "Oh my God," she whispered, looking up from her phone to the TV and back again. "It's real. He's everywhere. Forbes, TechCrunch, The Wall Street Journal. The TV screen now showed B-roll footage of our office, of our employees collaborating, of me leading a meeting. It was a world they had never seen, a life they never knew I was living. Analysts are projecting massive growth for Nexus AI, the anchor concluded, with some estimating Miller's personal net worth, based on his equity stake, to be in the range of $1.8 billion. $1.8 billion. That was the number that broke them. My dad let out a shaky breath and slowly set his glass down on the table. Ethan just stared at me, his face a mask of shock and something else I couldn't quite decipher. It looked like the world he had so carefully constructed, a world where he was at the top and I was at the bottom, had just been shattered into a million pieces. The silence stretched on, filled with the ghosts of 1,000 dismissive words, 1,000 condescending jokes, 1,000 moments of quiet pity. And in that moment, I wasn't the failure at the dinner table anymore. I was the headline. This was the moment that changed everything, when I finally took back control of my own story. Thank you for sticking with me to this point. You are amazing. If you could do me a huge favor and like this video and comment the number 1 down below, it lets me know you've been on this journey with me. It doesn't just help more people find this story. It shows me that my experiences mean something to someone out there. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to continue sharing the rest of this journey. The spell was finally broken by my father. He turned from the television to me, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Andrew," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Why? Why didn't you tell us?" The question was so absurd, so completely devoid of self-awareness, that I almost laughed. Tell you? I had been trying to tell them for more than a decade. I had tried to tell them with my programming awards, with my business plans, with my passion. They just hadn't been listening. Before I could answer, Ethan found his voice. "This is a joke, right? This is some kind of elaborate prank." He looked around the table, searching for an ally, but everyone was just staring at me. "It's not a joke, Ethan," I said, my voice calm and steady. It felt good to finally speak without the weight of their judgment crushing me. "But, for $1 billion?" Chloe said, still scrolling frantically through her phone. "How is that even possible? You work out of your apartment. You drive a Subaru." "My apartment is where I sleep," I said. "My office is downtown, on the 42nd floor, and I like my car." My mother started to cry, soft, confused tears. "We didn't know," she sobbed. "Honey, why did you hide this from us? We're your family." That's when the anger I had suppressed for so long finally surfaced. It wasn't hot and explosive, but cold and sharp. "Hide it," I said, my voice low. I looked each of them in the eye. "I didn't hide anything. I told you I was starting a company. I told you when I got my first investor. I tried to explain what I was building 100 times. You just weren't interested. You had already decided my story was one of failure. You weren't listening to the words. You were just waiting for me to say, 'I give up.'" My words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. The truth of them was reflected in their stunned faces. Suddenly, Ethan's phone started ringing. Then Chloe's. Then my dad's. A cacophony of jarring electronic sounds filled the heavy silence. "It's a reporter," Ethan said, looking at his screen with a panicked expression. "From the Wall Street Journal. How did they get my number?" "They want a comment," Chloe said, her voice strained. "From the family of the new tech billionaire." My dad looked at his phone as if it were a snake. "Bloomberg," he mouthed. They all looked at me, their eyes filled with a new kind of terror, the terror of public exposure. Their private family drama was about to become a public story, and they were completely unprepared. I calmly took a sip of water. "My communications team can provide you with some talking points if you'd like," I said. "The official statement is that my family has always been a source of private support." The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I stood up from the table. "If you'll excuse me," I said, "I have to get back to the office. This news breaking early has created a bit of a crisis I need to manage." I walked out of the dining room, leaving them there, frozen in the wreckage of their own assumptions, their phones still ringing, heralding the arrival of a world they were not a part of. I was in the hallway, putting on my jacket, when I heard my mother's panicked voice from the kitchen. She was on the phone, speaking in a hushed, frantic tone. I knew I shouldn't listen, but I couldn't help it. I stopped, my hand on the doorknob. "Carol, you won't believe what happened," she was saying, her voice cracking. "It's Andrew. The TV said he's a billionaire. A billionaire, Carol. We had no idea." There was a pause as my Aunt Carol, no doubt, reacted on the other end. "I don't know what to do," my mom continued, her voice rising in hysteria. "The reporters are calling. What are we supposed to say? We treated him so terribly. Richard always said his business was a joke." Another pause. I could imagine my aunt's saccharine, calming voice trying to smooth things over. "But we should have supported him," my mother cried, and what she said next hit me like a physical blow. "I feel sick. I remember when he was just starting out after his first company failed. Richard was going to give him $20,000 from his savings. Just a small loan to help him get back on his feet. Richard felt so bad for him. My breath caught in my throat. I had no idea. My father had considered helping me? After all the lectures, all the disapproval. He had actually thought about it? And you know what you said, Carol?" My mom went on, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper laced with dawning horror. "I remember it so clearly. You told him it would be like throwing money into a bonfire. You said, 'Richard, you'd be enabling his delusion. Don't throw away part of Andrew's inheritance on some childish fantasy. Sometimes you have to let them hit rock bottom to learn.' And Richard listened to you. He put the checkbook away." I leaned against the wall, the strength gone from my legs. Aunt Carol. My sweet, concerned Aunt Carol. It wasn't just passive-aggressive comments at dinner. It was active sabotage. She had stood between me and the one small gesture of faith my father had been willing to make. She had whispered poison in his ear, cloaking it as concern, and he had listened. That single act had reinforced his belief that I was a lost cause. It had solidified the family narrative for years to come. My mother was still talking, but I couldn't hear her anymore. A cold, hard clarity washed over me. The lack of belief from my family wasn't just a passive thing born of ignorance. It had been actively cultivated by one of their most trusted confidants. The betrayal was so deep, so insidious, it took my breath away. I straightened up, opened the front door, and walked out into the cold night air without looking back. It wasn't just their ignorance I had been fighting against. It was a calculated campaign to ensure I would fail. And I had won anyway. The 3 months that followed were a blur. The Bloomberg story didn't just make a splash. It created a tidal wave. I became, overnight, the subject of intense public fascination. My face was on the cover of Forbes and Wired. I did interviews with journalists I had only ever read. I gave a keynote speech at a massive tech conference, my voice echoing through a hall filled with thousands of people who were hanging on my every word. Nexus AI exploded. The validation from the press and the infusion of cash from our Series D round allowed us to accelerate all our plans. We hired the best engineers in the world. We acquired a smaller AI company. We opened offices in London and Singapore. I was living a life I had only ever dreamed of, working 20-hour days fueled by caffeine and pure adrenaline. My little project had become a global enterprise. My personal life, however, was strangely quiet. I didn't buy a mansion or a fleet of supercars. I stayed in my same apartment, though my assistant, Ben, kept trying to convince me to move. I still drove my Subaru. The money was just a number on a screen, a tool to build my vision. It didn't feel real. What also didn't feel real was the barrage of messages from my family. They started the morning after the dinner. Long, rambling texts from my mother filled with apologies and regret. Awkward, formal emails from my father saying he was immensely proud and would love to talk. And a single, shocking text from Ethan that just said, "I am so sorry. I was a complete ass." I read them all, but I didn't reply. I didn't have the energy or the emotional bandwidth to deal with it. It was too much, too soon. Their sudden reversal felt cheap. They weren't proud of me. They were impressed by the number. They were reacting to the headlines just like the rest of the world. For years, I had craved their approval. A single "we believe in you." Now that I had it, I found that it didn't mean anything. It had arrived too late. One evening, after a particularly grueling week of back-to-back meetings, I was scrolling through my phone and saw an article about my family. A local paper had done a small piece on them. It had a photo of my parents outside their house, looking proud and slightly bewildered. The article quoted my father saying, "We always knew Andrew was special. We gave him the freedom to follow his passions." I felt a bitter laugh escape my lips. The revisionist history had already begun. They were recasting themselves as the supportive parents of a tech prodigy. A few days later, Liam and I were in my office late at night, planning our next quarter. "Your family reached out?" he asked gently. I nodded. "They're trying. Are you going to talk to them?" I looked out the window at the glittering expanse of Seattle. The city lights looked like a vast network of possibilities. "I don't know," I said honestly. "What do you say to people who only learned to see you when the rest of the world told them you were worth looking at?" Liam didn't have an answer. He just put a hand on my shoulder. He understood. He had been there in the garage. He had seen the tears of frustration after a brutal phone call with my father. He knew the truth. I knew that eventually I would have to face them. But not yet. For now, I needed to live in this new world, the one I had built for myself. A world where my value wasn't determined by a family dinner, but by the work I was doing and the future I was creating. I needed to learn to be the person everyone thought I was, without forgetting the person I had been when no one was watching. After nearly 4 months of radio silence from my end, I finally agreed to see them. Not at their house, not on their turf. I told them to come to the Nexus AI headquarters on a Friday afternoon. They arrived together, my mother, my father, Ethan, and Chloe, looking completely out of place in our lobby of glass, steel, and bustling young employees. Ben, my assistant, escorted them up to the 42nd floor. As they stepped out of the elevator, they were met with a panoramic view of the city and a workspace buzzing with energy. I saw them exchange wide-eyed glances. This was real. I met them at the conference room. I was polite but distant. "This is incredible, Andrew," my father said, his voice full of awe as he looked around. "It's a long way from the garage," I said simply. We sat down at the long mahogany table. For a few moments, no one spoke. Then my father cleared his throat. "Son," he began, there's no easy way to say this. We were wrong. About everything. We were blind and I am so deeply sorry." His voice cracked on the last word, and I saw tears welling up in his eyes. It was the first time in my life I had ever seen my father cry. My mother was already weeping softly into a tissue. "We thought we were protecting you," she whispered. "We were so afraid you would fail that we never gave you a chance to succeed. Can you ever forgive us?" I looked at them, and for the first time, I didn't see the titans of judgment who had haunted my past. I just saw 2 aging parents who had made a terrible mistake. Then Ethan spoke, and his voice was raw with a humility I had never heard from him before. "I wasn't trying to protect you," he said, looking me straight in the eye. "I was jealous, and I was arrogant. My whole life I was the successful one. It was my identity. I couldn't stand the idea that you, my weird little brother who played with computers, might be building something I couldn't understand. It was easier to tear you down than to admit I was wrong. It was pathetic, and I'll be ashamed of it for the rest of my life." Chloe nodded, her own eyes red. "We all followed his lead. It was a toxic family dynamic, and you were the one who paid the price for it. There's no excuse. Their apologies were real. I could feel it. They weren't just saying what they thought I wanted to hear. The shock of the past few months had forced them into a painful but necessary self-reflection. I took a deep breath. "I appreciate you saying all this," I said, and I meant it. "But you have to understand something. The money, the valuation, that's not what this was about. I don't need you to believe in my success. I needed you to believe in me. When I was broke, when I was failing, that's when it would have mattered." "We know," my father said quietly, "and we will spend the rest of our lives trying to make it up to you if you let us." It wasn't a magic fix. A decade of damage couldn't be undone in a single conversation. But it was a start. It was a crack in the wall that had stood between us for so long. For the first time, we weren't playing our old, tired roles. We were just a family, sitting in a conference room high above the city, trying to figure out how to put the pieces back together. We talked for another hour. They asked questions, real questions about my work, about the struggles, about Liam, about the vision for Nexus AI. For the first time, they were actually listening. As they were getting ready to leave, my father paused at the door. "That reporter from Bloomberg," he said. "She asked you what your biggest challenge was in building the company. I saw the interview online." I nodded, remembering the question. "You didn't mention the lack of funding, or the competition, or the investors who tried to betray you," he continued, his voice soft. "You said the biggest challenge was the loneliness." I held his gaze. "It was," I said. He just nodded, a world of regret in that simple gesture, and then they were gone. I stood alone in the conference room, looking out at the city as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The journey had been incredibly, profoundly lonely. But in that loneliness, I had found something I never would have discovered otherwise. Myself. I had learned to trust my own instincts, to rely on my own resilience, to be my own source of validation when the world, and my own family, offered none. The truth is, their approval, as much as I once desperately craved it, was never going to be the thing that made me succeed. My success came from a place deep inside me, a stubborn, unyielding belief in what I was building. It came from the support of the few people who saw me clearly, like Professor Reed and especially Liam. It came from the fire forged in the crucible of their doubt. I realized the real victory wasn't the moment my face appeared on the television screen. The real victory wasn't the shocked looks on their faces or the jaw-dropping valuation. The real victory happened years ago, in a dusty garage, when I chose to believe in myself even when no one else would. It happened every single day that I got up and chose to keep building, to keep fighting, to honor my own vision against a constant barrage of skepticism. My family's apology was the closing of a painful chapter, but it wasn't the climax of the story. The climax had been happening all along, in quiet moments of solitary work and defiant hope. They believe in me now because Bloomberg and Forbes and the Wall Street Journal told them to. They believe in the $4.2 billion number. But I had to believe in myself when my net worth was negative and my only asset was an idea. In the end, my family wasn't the source of my doubt or my motivation. They were just the last to know that I was right all along. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I hope it resonated with you in some way. It's a strange and difficult journey when the people closest to you don't see the path you're on. Have you ever had to fight for a dream that no one else understood? I'd be honored to read about it. Please share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.